Hi, I'm Cobb Brandt, and I'm going to talk to you tonight about Minnesota's invasive plant protection laws. We're going to first start by looking at this beautiful plant behind me that's purple loosestrife. This plant was alleged 20 years ago that this was going to dominate all wetlands, and there were people that equivalated this to AIDS. This was going to be the end of all marsh vegetation. Well, I think you can see from this beautiful plant that purple loosestrife has blended in with all the other aquatic vegetation just fine, and I don't think it's causing any problems at all. So I'm not going to talk to you about purple loosestrife tonight, except to say to you that this is not a protected plant. It's declared an invasive species, and the government wants you to remove these and not leave them on your shoreline, and if I wanted to, I could legally take that plant and remove it. I choose not to because it's an isolated plant and I think it's beautiful. Now what I am going to talk to you about is a plant called the narrow leaf cattail. Now, very few people know the difference between narrow leaf cattail and broadleaf cattail. Broadleaf cattail was part of our wetlands when we had biodiversity. We had all kinds of different plants, all kinds of different birds, we had muskrats. And now what we've got basically in the southern half of Minnesota is a monoculture, which means we have a complete dominance of cattail and there are no other plants mixed in with it. Now the interesting part of this story is this plant is an invasive. The DNR still has the most invasive plant in the state of Minnesota, which is narrow leaf cattail, is a protected plant, and you can be issued a citation for removing an invasive species. And what the point that I'm trying to share with you here tonight is that if you have an invasive species, the law should be evenly applicable to all invasive species plants, not just selected ones that the DNR wants to pick out and say, well, this is invasive we want to keep and this invasive we don't want to keep. So I had two legislators, Jen Olson and John Benson, introduced a bill to the legislature in 2010 to get the law changed so that you could remove narrow leaf cattail from your own shoreline. I'm not advocating that we eradicate the plant, but I think it's pretty ridiculous that we protect an invasive species plant. So a little later here we're going to show you a tool, and we're going to show you how it cuts an invasive species plant. And because I've been unsuccessful pursuing this with the DNR and unsuccessful pursuing this with the legislature, I find myself in a position where I don't see much further recourse that I have but to cut a narrow leaf cattail and send a picture of me cutting the narrow leaf cattail to the Department of Natural Resources and ask that I be given a citation so that we can go down and we can hold this up in front of a judge and say, Judge, how does this work that these plants are all invasive species plants and I can be given a citation for cutting this one and not this one? In other words, I think that invasive species should not be subject to favoritism. So we're going to fire up a tool and we're going to commit an act of civil disobedience here tonight. We're not here to break any laws. We're only here to take the minimum plant cutting necessary to get us a citation, to get us in front of a judge, and let the DNR explain to the judge how one invasive plant is protected and another one is not. So with that, we're going to move over to this fancy machine and we're going to cut a couple of narrow leaf cattail. Okay, so here we are again standing in front of the narrow leaf cattail, an invasive species that has taken over this entire shoreline. You can see a little bit of the lawn here along the edge, and then you can see a 100% dominance. We call this a monoculture, of which nothing exists except for narrow leaf cattail. I have in my hands here a conventional aquatic plant cutter. It cuts submerged plants, it cuts emergent plants, and we're going to fire this up and we're just going to cut off just a few of these narrow leaf cattail, just enough to get us in front of a judge and get a judge's rendering on whether the DNR has the authority to tell you that you can't remove an invasive species plant from your own property. Nice machine. And as Judge Wapner would say, Exhibit A.